We're often asked why young people are increasingly disinterested in politics, democracy and civic life. Why has it been going down over the last, say, 40 years, and is that a problem? For instance, is it a problem that the only election that today's 12-year-olds will remember is one in which only a fifth of the population chose the party of the Prime Minister? I mean, it might be if we start to talk about democracy as majority rule. In fact, they're growing up in a country where twice as many people didn't vote as those who voted for the Prime Minister. So could you blame them for thinking the country is beyond caring? Yet on first thought, people often look for the one thing that's been different about the last few years. Young people may say it's the politicians and blame them for being out of touch. Some say it's the media feeding youthful obsessions and creating self-centered generations. Others blame political parties that have become too similar, and so it goes on. But shifts like this are never about one simple thing, and usually they're not intended. I mean, one change leads to another, but a bit like lobsters in a pot, we often don't notice things are getting too bad until it's too late. So we'd like to speak up on behalf of young people in this specific respect, because youth will always be youth, but the world they inhabit is shifting quickly, and they're inheriting a world where they're increasingly unequal, alienated from each other and disillusioned with the way power is shared. And I'm going to show you how we've let them down, how we live in a country that's slowly running down the batteries of society, and how we haven't cared enough to put them on recharge. So now we're handing down complex problems without preparing them with solutions. So here are three big things that have changed so much that they demand that we rethink how we prepare young people for life in today's Britain. So firstly, how has our income and lifestyles made our political options come adrift from any ideologies that have congruence for young people? Because back in the 60s, the richest people had about 3 times the income of the poorer. The poorer section were often manufacturing workers, and the wealthier were their managers, and the managers made more of the decisions, and so when the workers got together they could unite and fight for their fair share. That's a very simple way of saying what the Labour Party is about, but look what happened over the next 40 years. The gap between rich and poor has grown so much that you can't simply draw a circle around any section of society anymore. Today's section of the population who have the same income as the poor of the 60s are actually in the minority. Yet that era is when many of today's older people became loyal to their political party of choice. By illustration, look at the top grey line here. It shows how 60% of the population born before the war have stayed loyal to their political party. But with every successive generation, such party attachment has got lower, and now only around 15% have a firm choice of political party. Similarly, this graph shows how most people tend to stick to the beliefs they held while they were younger. But those beliefs and their accompanying practices of civic engagement haven't been getting passed on. And in this example, we see how those who grew up in the era that built the welfare state still value it highly, but 2 generations later, less than half can see why it's such a prized collective endeavour. In short, the world that shaped our political parties has gone, and young people have very little connection to it. Instead, young people have been inheriting a steady drop-off in civic connection. They didn't start it. The battery has been leaking for quite some time, and our nation is like a big machine with little power behind it. Young people don't even know what the machine is supposed to do. They're probably as idealistic as ever, but with fewer ideologies to connect that idealism to. This growth in affluence has also changed lifestyles, which has had a knock-on effect to how we build community. Way back in the 60s, it made sense for us to have a stake in owning national industries together. But now most people are better off. We live much more autonomously. And life is more reliable if you can afford not to depend on others, and most people can. They can have their own car, their washing machine, their TV with hundreds of channels, spare time to watch it while you consider what next to buy from the 500 brands appealing to the chooser. Freedom of choice feels great, and we love determining what we own and how we live. But it's also a little bit intoxicating, and consumerism, like any intoxicant, is nice in moderation but poisonous in excess. And that independence has had an impact on our sense of togetherness. The preoccupation of consuming shaped our nation in the 90s. It reduced government to a form of joint management and services agency. People we voted in to sort it all out for us so we can just get on with more important things. Now, some people complain that young people seem so entitled these days. They just expect things to be done for them. But you don't have to be a genius to see why, when it's been the spirit of the age they grew up in. But actually, recent research suggests this generation's disillusionment is such that they now expect less of government, expect to have to put in more themselves, but that's because the majority now believe that the UK's best days have been and gone. Why are we bequeathing them such a defeatist attitude? Why aren't we showing them how to make a great nation? In fact, quite the opposite. We're leaving them to believe the best thing politicians can now offer them is very little. Then they won't get disappointed and vote them out of office. So politics loses power because small government machinery can run on low. Affluence and personal freedom have also increased mobility for some, which has given them the option to be less obliged to their cultural origins, to migrate away from the working class roots or make different choices from their parents' ethnic group. Some people say that one way we deal with increasing social difference is actually by increasing our indifference to others, by loosening the ties that bind. But that doesn't feel too bad in a world of multiple identities because there's a niche for every preference on the internet. Well, it's certainly reassuring to find, meet and hang out with those who share your choices and fascinations. Yet when you do that, you spend more time in conversation with people like you, and you become less used to making practical choices based on negotiation and compromise with those different from you. But that's exactly what democratic politics is, working out how to live together in peace as dissimilar people. And that's not only a dying art, but it's a dying way of life. It seems so unnecessary to most young people. They feel happy when their personal batteries are charged up connecting to old friends and like-minded communities across the globe. But in a country with weak civic batteries, they've been dangerously distanced from reckoning with the harsher realities of life. Well, assuming you agree with all of this, you're probably still wondering why we think there's a problem here. If the problem is affluence, doesn't it show that things are working? Well, my problem is this. It's not that things haven't been going well, for some at least. It's the probability that we've peaked. It seems that we've cashed the last check as a fairly egalitarian post-colonial society, and now are passing on a fragmenting nation in a fast-changing world, and our children are not in on the solution. We have to accept that the world is changing and the old ways are really not sustainable. As the baby boomers retire, they're retiring with a good amount of a highly indebted nation's wealth just when other countries are growing, and the need for us to become trusted players in the global community is huge. But our children aren't being prepared for that. They're not being helped to form a stable, internationalist Britain in a global world. They're being coached for careers that may not even exist if we perpetuate inward-looking lives in unequal communities in a country that will need a bigger vision to survive and thrive. I mean, what do young people bring to mind when we talk about the practical solutions to the problems they're going to have to face together in the future? Well, it's mostly personality choices between leaders they see every now and then on the telly. Individuals of the professional political classes, now almost inevitably so because they've got to be adept enough to grapple with the dizzyingly complex realities of life, administering an increasingly legislated nation, steering its way through a global marketplace in a fast-moving and conflict-ridden world. And at the same time, they've got to be charismatic enough to survive relationships in a dumbed-down media acquiescing to mass disinterest in all but the most mundane fascinations of a politician's daily choices. So I'm saying that times have changed more than most recognise, and too many young people are oblivious to the thinking that shaped our nation, to the decisions and the activities that have forged long-lasting peace and prosperity. They're invisible to them. Much of it's complex, nuanced, and compared to the rest of life, it feels boring, like the EU and the UN. And the merits of organising, even though it's complicated, have been forgotten or discredited, and so many people suppose there is and what happens is taken for granted, but the quality of democratic participation is falling precisely as the challenge increases. The next generation need to be brought into an understanding of how society works best. That doesn't mean telling them what or how to think or how to vote, but educating them about how it all happens so they can take informed decisions and responsible action. Nothing else is going to redress the leakage of democratic competence from the next generation except for some kind of global crisis. A crisis that stops our fantasies of endless growth and get-rich-quick aspirations. The cost of that is too high. Doing nothing is a deluded option. And it's a much more costly option than restoring the loss of power and capability to the next generation. The batteries need replenishing, and the steady trickle of charge needs to accompany every moment of our young people's development. That's why we believe in education for citizenship, because it's the right and necessary way to help each generation assume their role as equal makers of a fair and inclusive society. It's also their due entitlement to be told the rules and expectations of the nation in which they were born as equals. So it's not a subject for the cleverest, for the select few, for the possible future leaders, the gifted orators, the would-be politicians. It's for everyone growing up today, because everyone now in school has a stake in managing our country in a changing world. To use their heads and their hearts to address their challenges and to make their choices. To be in on the next generation UK as responsible nation makers, not nation takers. To rejuvenate the machine of our collective life rather than be left to wonder why we let the batteries die just when they were most needed. Batteries low back